Hi guys, I'm Hannah Erickson and I'm going to be talking about the book The Battle Hymn of a Tiger Mother by Amy Chua. So I really love this book. I read it very quickly, A, because I had to, but also I really enjoyed it. But I'd encourage you guys to read it because it's, I think, very healthy to see parenting from a different perspective than maybe what we're familiar with. And there's a lot of things that we can gain from various parenting styles as well. So I'll give you a brief overview of the book and then I'll dive into those 3 questions that Emily wants us to hit on. So the book is written by Amy. Amy is a Chinese mother. She is a mother of Chinese descent as well. Both of her parents are Chinese and she had a Chinese mother herself, so she was raised using this Chinese parenting style. She met her husband at Harvard Law School. They were both attending law school at Harvard. He is white and Jewish and was raised using a Western style. His parents were pretty low-key, pretty relaxed. And the two of them decided to raise their children using the Chinese parenting style. They have 2 daughters, Sophia and Lulu, and they're both extremely successful. After I finished the book, I Instagram and Facebook stalked their whole family, and Lulu, the youngest daughter, just graduated from Harvard and is now attending law school herself, so extremely successful family. And Amy would say that that has a large part to do because of her being a Chinese mother. So let's get into what that means and what that is. So the first question is, how would you define Chinese mothering and what is your first impression of this approach? So Chinese mothering it's just a parenting style, but it requires very, very strict obedience and essentially is inflicting the will of the mother onto her child or children. It requires rigid obedience to parents, elders, teachers, and any authority figure. And it requires excellence. In the book it says that the Chinese mother believes that 1, schoolwork always comes first, 2, an A- is a bad grade, 3, your children must be 2 years ahead of their classmates in math, 4, you must never compliment your children in public, 5, if your child ever disagrees with the teacher or coach, you must always take the side of the teacher or coach. 6, the only activities your children should be permitted to do are those in which they can eventually win a medal. And 7, that medal must be gold. So, very, very high expectations for their children, and they don't let up easily. A Chinese mother believes that her children are not fragile and can handle and should be able to handle tough and harsh criticism, to the point of which Western parents would typically think is unkind, unjust, and maybe too harsh and intense. So that's kind of brief over, one big definition of Chinese mothering. It's strict parenting that imposes the will of the mother onto the child. So my first impression of this approach is that it's just tough. I initially thought that it'd be very difficult to have a happy and positive relationship between a mother and a child with this type of parenting style, and I also thought it'd be hard for a child to develop self-esteem using this approach as well. But the book unfolds in a way that you see that it's adaptable. Well, it's not adaptable, but it can work for certain children and certain parents. The second question is, discuss 3 differences between Chinese and Western mindsets when it comes to parenting. So there's quite a few, but Amy herself lists 3 main ones, so those are the 3 that I chose to talk about. The first one is the parents' view of their child's self-esteem. The second is Chinese parents believe their children owe them everything. And 3, Chinese parents believe they know what is best for their children, and therefore override all their children's own desires and performances. So, the first one, parents' view of their child's self-esteem. So we kind of already talked about this with the first question, but I'll read a quote from the book. It says, Western parents are concerned with their children's psyches. Chinese parents aren't. They assume strength, not fragility, and as a result, they behave differently. So one example of this is how the two different mindsets approach academics. So a Chinese mother would, if a Chinese mother's daughter or son, just their child, came home with a report card that showed a B or an A minus, they'd freak out. And they would yell, they'd scream, they'd tell their child that they were dumb or stupid, worthless, a disgrace. And then they would make their child practice and get down to the nitty-gritty of whatever subject they were failing in, and make them outperform themselves so that the next time they performed, they were at the top of their class. Whereas if a Western parent had a child who came home with a B or an A minus, and if the child was disappointed, the parent would probably coddle their child in some sort of way and saying hey, you did your best, that's all we can expect, or a B is not that bad, an A minus isn't that bad, that's a great score, you should be proud of yourself, or even blaming the teacher or the school system for not getting a higher grade. So the difference is how they approach their child with the situation that they're not happy with. The Chinese mother saying, you're dumb, and the Western parent saying, you did your best, kid, and they both are coming from a place of trying to help their child progress, but they both see a different way to get to that progression. The second difference, Chinese parents believe their children owe them everything. It kind of plays out in the way that they impose their will onto their children. Because they believe that their child owes them everything, they believe and expect and demand that they have respect, and that their child will obey them, and that they'll honor them, and in their old age that they will take care of them. Whereas a Western mindset is not really like that. Western mindset is kind of like the parent's there to serve the child, and it's a service opportunity of the parent to help the child, and they don't necessarily expect in their old age to be taken care of by their children. That's why it's so popular in Western cultures to see retirement homes and nursing center homes, whereas it's kind of absurd in a Chinese culture to have those type of things, because they expect their family or their children to take them in their old age when they need care. And there's an example of that in the book even. In the book, Amy's mother-in-law gets really sick. She gets leukemia and she is bedridden, and Amy is very adamant about needing her mother-in-law to come and just stay with them. She refuses to let her live it on her own or to be in the hospital by herself, and she takes on her mother-in-law. Even though they didn't really quite get along, that's something that's very culturally ingrained in her, and so she pushed for that. And the third main difference was that Chinese parents believe that they know what is best for their children, and therefore override all their children's own desires and performances. So a good example of this in the book is that Amy puts both of her children into classical music instrument lessons. Does that make sense? She put her oldest daughter, Sophia, in piano lessons, and her youngest daughter, Lulu, she put into violin lessons, and she demanded perfection. Even at times when they said that they didn't want to practice, when they didn't want to play, when they didn't want to be involved in such a high level of performance anymore, she made them practice for hours on end a day, 2-3 hours a day. Weekends, birthdays, holidays, vacations, kind of insane. On vacations they would find a piano at the hotel, and they'd practice for 2-3 hours. And that was because that is what Amy saw was the best for her children. So she overrode their desire to play with friends or have a day off, because she saw that that would be the best thing for their future. Whereas a Western parent's mindset is just kind of one of ease, relaxation. Like, okay, if you're not enjoying piano lessons anymore, like if you're not going to work hard for it anymore on your own, like I'm not going to help. Or not, I'm not going to help, but I'm not going to force you to do that. I'm not going to override your desire. So those are some of the differences between Chinese and Western mindsets. I hope that makes sense.